Good morning. It is a pleasure to see all of you here today. How many of you were at the museum last night? Wasn't that a phenomenal experience? What you experienced last night was leadership of place. And today, as you entered this grand hall, what you heard was music from a Canadian. And you are going to hear and see and experience the Ottawa and Canadian culture that will be woven throughout this conference. And in the embrace of this place, we pay respect to the Indigenous people who are the guardians of this land. On the screen and in your program book is an Indigenous Affirmation, which is also on the University of Ottawa's website. It is a living document of the knowledge keepers of this land. And I want you to take special note of the last line, and that is, we honor the courageous leaders, past, present, and future of this place, end quote. It ties in so nicely with our theme. I want to thank the Ottawa conference planners for sharing that and bringing that forward so that we could also share that with all of you. I also want to acknowledge our three conference conveners from the Telfer School of Management. Ingrid Richter, who is the executive in residence, Glenn Orsak, who is the director of the executive education program, and Dinah Mazudas, who is an associate professor in the Telfer School of Management. Now, they are quite the leadership trio or triad or triumvirate, whatever you want to call. We all know in music, a triad is a set of three notes, right? In music, a trio is three voices that could be singing the same note, they can be singing in harmony, or they can be in discord. A triumvirate is a political regime that can bring three powerful people together to rule. Well, these three planning conveners are indeed three powerful individuals who bring their own unique voices and have created a beautiful melody of a conference. So please sing your praises by applauding them, the Ottawa Trio. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the International Leadership Association's board chair, Mike Hardy. He is the founding director of the Center for Trust, Peace, and Social Relations at the University of Coventry. But before that, he was a diplomat, and he worked for the British Council for many years on a very important project of intercultural dialogue. That topic and that work took him around the globe, living and working in areas like Cairo and Indonesia and Jerusalem and many other places. When he returned and in his present role, his work gave him this heightened experience and awareness of the importance of leadership. And in his quest for leadership knowledge, he searched out and found some of our ILA members who in turn brought him forward to the ILA, and he has been an engaged ILA member on the board and now finishing up his first year as our board chair. In his education, he was trained as an economist. In his work, he is an author, he is a teacher, and he is an administrator. And in his personal life, he is a husband, a father, and a grandfather. Please welcome to the stage, Mike Hardy.
So this is quite a journey that Sin describes, but welcome to you all and good morning. And isn't this great? We're here after a considerable amount of planning, the amazing work of our conveners and our staff, the ILA staff, who I must thank before I do anything else. I want to spend just a couple of moments with you at the beginning of our conference. 1,000 people have come to Ottawa to do what we do in the autumn every year, to get together, to meet one another, to network, to push our own passions and to seek out others. As Sin said, I joined the ILA. I'm one of your newest members. It's an astonishing process where I sought out learning about leadership because I was a leader, not very good, and I soon got very much engaged with the emotional intelligence of this organization, its passions and its concern to change things to make the world a better place in our simple purpose statement. But I want to spend a couple of minutes only on my theme of seeking inspiration. When I sought knowledge when I joined the International Leadership Association, I'm going to encourage you to seek inspiration, not just within our ranks, but outside our ranks. How many people are not here? How many networks have you got that don't become our networks? And that's my general theme. So, in a few slides here, you know our purpose. This is a very challenging task. I think it's a brilliant, concise, compact commitment that we make, and we think about this every time the board meets, every time the board subcommittee meets, and every time we're in conventions such as this. The two things that my research does actively, and my research centre, which is quite big now and quite busy at Coventry University, are the two drivers of social relations. And they're the two things that I think are at the heart of some of the challenges we face in our work in leadership. This passionate need to belong that drives individuals, wherever they are, however advantaged or disadvantaged they are, the need to belong. And at the same time, the need that we all have to be different, that leads to the diversity of humankind. Now, those two drivers, the need to belong and the need to be different, are, for me, in my research, the center of the issues and challenges that we face. How can we juxtapose those in a constructive and productive way? You'll know also from those of you who I've met before at West Palm Beach that I seek my inspiration beyond the ILA too, and I get it from very, very good places. My grandson, I referred to at West Palm Beach in the closing ceremony. He's a great guy. He's 9 years old. His relationship with me is not based on judgment. It's based on empathy, on seeking mutual understanding. Here he is last Saturday, and I wanted to share it to you. He's 9 years old and valuing the power of teamwork. They won the cup last Saturday, and I went to Manchester to watch them. He's holding it there. And this huge sense of elation when you achieve something together, I found hugely inspirational. That's the segue from William when he was holding his ice cream last year in the West Palm Beach closing. In the next slide, it tries to capture in one picture where I think we are in our strange and turbulent world. You know, historically, we've relied on a political process to help confront some of the issues, some of the challenges to which I've just referred. And I think politics is broken, largely broken, that we're struggling with the processes upon which we rely so carefully. Not everywhere, but in many places. The politics of the short term is distracting us from the politics of the long term. The future for my grandson, William, is being determined now by a series of very short-term, quick-fix leadership decisions, not the big issues that stretch beyond our generation into his and beyond that. So, what's my call to you at this conference? If I can provide a modest leadership push at this stage in the beginning of our conference, it's this. Let's have the next slide. This is from Mark Twain, and you'll know it. And I'll put it up just to remind us that sometimes wit and clever people help us. The two most important days of your life, the day you're born and the day you find out why. He meant it in an amusing way, but I think it's something I think about a lot. Why are we here? Why are we committed to the ILA? Why are we seeking inspiration to create better things for future generations? So my call to action for you at the beginning of the conference is about reaching out. I'm strongly of the view that we are a committed group of people, an amazing membership, emotionally passionate about the value of leadership, scholarship, of practice, and of policy, that nexus between the two which makes us so distinct. But each of us have a wealth of networks of our own. And I want our call to be to bring those in, to make your networks our networks. And the power and the exponential growth of the energy that we can mobilize will, I think, be very worthwhile. The ILA is a convening organization, but let's convene more people. Let's bring those who aren't currently passionate and engaged in. Your networks should become our networks. And that's my call to you, that we're a tight group, a close family of believers. And there are lots out there that once they bounce into us in the way I did 5 years ago, will never want to leave. So thank you all very much for coming and really enjoy the conference. Now, one of the ways we seek inspiration in the ILA is to celebrate and respect those who bring great achievement. And in this next section, we are doing just that. And I'd like to ask my fellow board member, Eliane, to join me and introduce our Lifetime Achievement Award. Thank you, Eliane.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's an honor for me this morning to be presenting this award to Nancy Adler, the S. Brafman Chair in Management at McGill University. Nancy was my first introduction to leadership scholarship over a decade ago, and she was my introduction to ILA. I'm from Rwanda. Nancy's background is linked to the Holocaust, and our dialogues when I met her were really critical to my early explorations in courageous leadership. So it's a great honor for me to be here and to honor her and to honor the memory of her family and the amazing link that she allowed me to have with her mother. So let me just tell you about Nancy Adler. So she's a leading expert on global leadership, cross-cultural management, and women's leadership. In addition to consulting for private organizations and government organizations around the world, she has been honored as one of Canada's top university professors, and I've heard her talk. She's amazing. And she has received McGill's first Distinguished Teaching Award in Management. She's a prolific author with more than 125 articles, 10 books, and edited volumes including International Dimensions of Organizational Behavior and Women in Management Worldwide. She has produced 3 films and is a visual artist known for her paintings, monotypes, and ceramics. Her paintings are held in private collections across the globe. So Nancy will be giving an invited presentation on the perfections of imperfection, the economics of beauty, at 11:45. So I encourage any of you who will be able to attend her talk. And Nancy, I'd like you to come up, please. On behalf of the ILA and our Legacy Committee, it is our honor to induct you in the ILA Virtual Hall of Fame as a luminary of the leadership profession with the ILA Lifetime Achievement Award.
Thank you, Eliane. This moment has a depth that I can't even begin to talk about. And I have the image of you and my mother and myself standing by the lake, pretending that I was painting and they were writing, but in fact, writing the stories of our lives so we could for the first time hear them. Thank you. I have another honor this morning, and it comes from the fact that, as you now know, I'm both an artist and a management professor, two very different worlds. But increasingly, I've come to understand that I can understand the world much more powerfully through art and talk about the most meaningful aspects of leadership by using my artistic vocabulary and not so much that vocabulary I was first trained in. Remember that econometrics degree I got and that I started working in Washington, D.C. as an econometrician? Oh well, we change. Art's power is to allow us to know ourselves profoundly as individuals, as organizations, and as whole societies. I now bring those two worlds, arts and leadership, together by creating Leading Beautifully Awards, interpretive artworks that allow organizations to see who they really are. Today, I have the honor of awarding a Leading Beautifully Award to ILA. How often has ILA honored us as individuals? But when do we take the time to step back and to look at and celebrate who ILA really is? So I invite you to join me on an arts-inspired celebration of ILA by lifting your eyes up to the screen and watching. This is not a bowl. This is ILA. This bowl is not like most bowls. Before it was fired, its wide open, inviting shape risked collapse. What if it had collapsed? Would we have remembered that great leaders and great artists take more risks and fail more often than do other people? When a bowl collapses, the potter returns to the wheel and throws another, better bowl. This is not my first bowl. This is not a bowl. This is ILA. Let your eye follow the swirling glazes as each discovers its own path. Pick a splash of color. Imagine that that color is you, tracing your own unique contribution. As your color flows under, over, around its neighbors, it's transformed. Glossy meets matte, texture dissolves into shiny. Bold accentuates subtle. It takes courage to join this dynamic dance. What if I lose myself? What if I disappear altogether? Embracing my fear, it becomes clear. The beauty of the whole would be impossible without my color combining with those of all of you. This is not a bowl. This is ILA. ILA is not one color. It's a vibrant community of colors, passions, visions, values, experience. ILA creates beauty by daring to paint in contrast. The unprecedented result? surprises us all, and delights the world. Long before others, ILA recognized that leadership is global, not the domain of any one country, of any one gender, of any one ethnicity, of any one color. Likewise, ILA has an enviable history of inviting women, along with men, into the leadership conversation. ILA welcomes aesthetic and spiritual perspectives that take us far beyond the narrow, analytic language that still dominates so much of our management and leadership conversations. ILA, including today, insists on the truth and the research that reveals truth. It insists that it remains central to our appreciation of leadership and our understanding of the world. So the question is, where will ILA take us next? Where will you take us next? What colors will you use to remind us that we can only lead from where we stand? What colors will you use to show us that there's no neutral place to stand, that doing nothing at this moment in history is neither a leadership nor a human option? ILA, what colors will you use to support us when we fail to remember that we never stand alone? With profound humility, we, the people in this room, know that as a community, we have the courage to lead. Like this bowl, ILA is strong. We are wide open. Our surface celebrates our diversity. Our leadership is beautiful and generous. Thank you, ILA, for leading beautifully, generously, and courageously. And if I can invite Cynthia to join us, thank you, Cynthia, for leading beautifully, courageously, and generously. That's a portrait of a bowl.
Our open plenary keynote is leading from the vicious circle to the virtuous circle with courage, authenticity, and presence. Please welcome to the stage the Right Honourable Paul Martin, Senator Murray Sinclair, and the moderator, Cynthia Wesley Eskima.
And let's talk to my
I guess so, yeah. Good job. After you.
Please.
Go. Here.
Good morning, and thank you so much for
Go this
your
way.
attendance
Okay.
today, and thank you for honoring the lands on which we're meeting today for the Indigenous peoples that went before. I want to introduce two men, two amazing men, Senator Sinclair, who served the justice system in Manitoba for 25 years and was chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission from 2000 to 2015. He was appointed to the Canadian Senate on April 2nd, 2016. And there's a lot more that I could say about this man, but you're going to hear directly from him. The second, the Honourable Paul Martin, was the 21st Prime Minister of Canada. And out of that he wrote, "Hell or High Water, My Life in and Out of Politics." He's also the creator of the Martin Initiative. Good morning. So we're going to open the plenary with some questions, and then we're going to have a conversation between these two men. And the first one.
Sure.
Thanks. I would like to start with you, Senator Sinclair, and I'd like you to tell us about a pivotal moment in your life that actually influenced you and helped you to step forward for leadership in Canada.
That's a challenging question because in reality, over the course of a lifetime, there are many moments like that. And thinking about it, I can tell you that one area of great inspiration for me is the kind of thing that President Hardy talked about, and that is the relationship with children. And I would say that probably the greatest inspiration that I get in terms of wanting to keep doing what it is that I do is from my grandchildren. And it goes back to a moment of reflection that I had one time when I was speaking with students, and I said, when I was a young student entering university, I thought I was the most brilliant guy in the world. I didn't really think that there was anybody smarter than me. I realized there were a lot of other people cuter than me, but I thought there was nobody smarter than me. And then I got married. And and then I realized that in fact, whatever intelligence I had was subject to the will and control of others. And so it came to the point where I had to learn how to make it work in a relationship. But it was also when my children were born that I realized just how dumb I really was, and how challenging it was to become the kind of parent that you wanted to be, as opposed to what it was that you may have witnessed in the course of your lifetime. But when my grandchildren were born, then I became brilliant again. And I became brilliant because they kept telling me how brilliant I was, because they loved me. And I would say that one of the most favorite moments I have, and I have many favorite moments of conversations I have with my grandchildren, but one of the most favorite moments I have is when my granddaughter, Nemesian Nevance, and her English name is Sarah, when she was a little girl, she insisted that I had to go on Halloween with her, and I had to dress up like she dressed up. So I was Shrek one year. You can all imagine me as Shrek, right? I've just created an image for you that you undoubtedly will have a hard time shaking. So, but because I was Shrek, and all the kids in the neighborhood knew who Shrek was, as I was walking down the street with Sarah, all of the other kids joined us. And so by the time we got to the end of the first block, I probably had about 20 kids following our little parade. And when I got to we went from house to house, and when we got to one of the houses, all of the kids would go up to the door and, of course, ask for trick or treat. And then this one lady came out, and she was giving out the candies, and she said, and here's one for the little bumblebee, here's one for the princess, here's one for the archer, and here's one for, and she was naming all of them. And then she saw me standing on the sidewalk, and she said, and who's that out there? And my granddaughter, and I could hear them, my granddaughter said, oh, that's my mushum. It's a Ojibwe word for grandfather. That's my mushum. And she said, well, what's a mushum? And she thought for a minute, and this is a 4-year-old girl at the time. She thought for a minute, and she said, well, it's kind of like a grandpa, but only better. So that made me realize that everything that I was trying to do and trying to accomplish was because I had come to believe in the importance of creating an environment and a world for the children in my life and the grandchildren in my life, and to think about the future. And in accordance with the teaching of our people, which is that you must always think about the impact that you're going to have today upon the generation 7 generations down. And so that, for me, was a moment of great inspiration, and I think about it, and then I tell that story often.
Thank you very much. That's wonderful. And Mr. Martin?
Well, first of all, Senator, you and I are about the same age, and you have just blown our cover. But I think that's a tremendous story. The question is essentially, what did we learn, and how did it come about? As the senator has explained, I think that the older you get, the more you learn. But I guess I'll tell you simply a story that goes back to when I was 17 or 18 years old. I was born in southwestern Ontario. Those of you who are not from Canada would know, in the city of Windsor, which is opposite Detroit, so right in the heartland of North America. The Indigenous people are a very important and a growing part of the Canadian population and the Canadian economy. But when I was growing up, it was quite possible, and in fact, unfortunately, it is still today, to spend your life and never had met an Indigenous person from your own country. And at the age of 17 or 18, that I had not. And so what happened was I had spent one summer working in the Canadian oil fields in Western Canada while I was at university. And then the next year, I hitchhiked up to a place called Hay River, which is in the Canadian far north. And I got a job as a deckhand on the tug barges that serve the Mackenzie River. And to those of you who are not from Canada, the Mackenzie River is a massive river. It's the it's the Amazon of Canada, virtually in the north. And it flows into the Arctic Ocean. And all the cargo in the Northwest Territories is carried by tug barges on that river. So I got a job as a deckhand on one of those tug barges, and they're very large. They have an overall crew at any one time of 19 people. And all the other crew were young men my age, all Indigenous, either Inuit or First Nations or Métis Nation. And we worked together 24/7, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and what effectively is the land of the midnight sun, so that there was plenty of opportunity for us to sit around and talk and learn from each other. Now, those of you who know young men, teenagers, know that the conversations that they have among themselves are not necessarily exemplary, not the kind of conversation you would want anybody that you know to listen in on.
No, I'm the exception. So.
Yeah. I'm not sure about that, Senator. In any event, so we would sit around and we would chatting, but every so often, my shipmates we would get down to some of the issues that they faced, and if you want to feel ashamed of yourself, you will listen to what the Indigenous peoples of North America really have been through, what we have put them through, the fact that when we came here, because we couldn't speak their language, we decided that they had no culture, that they had no traditions, and all of this has built up to where we have got an enormous amount of work to do here in North America. But to be honest, I have spent a lot of time in Asia, a lot of time in Africa, and wherever Indigenous people are, they have to go through that same thing. And I'm going to make a comment about that at the end. But what I learned from these young men was an insight into what the world was and the world is all about. And when you think that the single biggest issue that we face as a globe is climate change, when you think that the destruction of our planet is quite conceivable, and then you understand that all of us who are not Indigenous have been raised to believe that we are above nature, and that fundamentally what the Indigenous people believe is that we are part of nature. And it is that belief of theirs that we are part of nature, which is going to give us the philosophical basis to do what has to be done. There is no way that if, in fact, we understood that we are part of nature, that the United States ever would have walked away from the Paris Accord on the environment.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
So let me just make one last thing. What I believe is very important now, that Canada, which now is making great strides in terms of our dealings with Indigenous people, and no small part of playing this was Senator Sinclair, who's probably brought down the most important single report in the history of this country in terms of Indigenous people. So, just one thing. I believe that the Indigenous people of the world have got to come forward, because we're not going to be able to paint the economy green. The environment is going to have to go to the core of business. And for us to make that judgment call, we're going to have to understand what it's all about. And in my opinion, it is that we are part of nature. And that's over to you, Senator.
Well, actually, that's a really great transition, because the next question is actually about just that. How do we rally allies to the cause? And what was it that in your life that brought you to the conclusion that we needed to actually build a relationship with other people in this country to get to where we need to go?
Well, I was raised in a part of the country which had signed treaties with newcomers in the 19th century, and we were raised with a very strong belief in the importance of treaties, and the importance of treaties initially always had been the formation of a partnership and a commitment to each other to support each other into the future. And there was a very quick move away from that sense of the treaties by the federal representatives and the provincial representatives, of course, but the Indigenous view of that relationship was always strong, and I was raised with that. And as I was doing the work with the various inquiries that I've been involved in, but in particular with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I really felt a strong commitment to remind Canada and to remind survivors of residential schools and their families and the communities from which they came that our commitment had always been to have a relationship with the rest of society, and that we had to recognize that the rest of society had failed in its obligations, but now they were recognizing their need to change from that failure to a more positive path, and we had to help them. We had to help them not by showing them the way, we had to help them by ourselves finding our sense of self-respect, our sense of who we could be and who we should be, so that they could match it. And so it was really a sense that we had some work to do for ourselves, but we also had to show them how the relationship was going to work. So it's much like, and I've always drawn the comparison between a political relationship like that and a family relationship. So when you get married to somebody and you find that you've failed somewhat in the relationship going forward, in order to renew it, you have to go back to first principles, and what were those? And what is it that you wanted to achieve by forming that relationship at the beginning? And so it was to remind Canadians what it was that they had said they would do, and to say, and we can help you do that now, because first is learning the truth of what it is that you've been doing, and that truth had largely been hidden over the course of Canadian history. But now that we know the truth, here's what we can learn from that truth.
Very good. Yeah, and that whole treaty relationship and all of the pieces, they're already there. They've been laid before the Canadian population, and it's up to you to really understand that. So, Mr. Martin, you became an ally. You started the Martin Initiative, the foundation that has actually been taken out across Canada and done a lot of work with young people. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and what actually prompted you to actually put that together?
This all occurred after I left government, unwillingly. So what our foundation is focused on education. Obviously, education for all of us. The reason that we're here in this room is that free education, in fact, was set up by people 100 years ago, and I think unless any of us belong to the British aristocracy, I suspect we need it. So we have focused on education, and the best way that I can describe it is we brought in a literacy course. Fundamentally, if you can't read or write by the end of grade 3, what happens is you get passed on, and you eventually drop out of either grade school or you drop out in high schools. We brought in what was a very successful and practiced literacy course. And to make a long story short, we went into 2 on-reserve schools. It was a 5-year program. In these 2 schools at the beginning, this is for the average on Indigenous schools, by the end of grade 3, 13% of kids could read and write. In the public high schools, over 70% could read and write. So we took this course in, which is one that we are now in the process of taking nationally as a research project. We went in, did the whole thing, working very closely with the Indigenous teachers. All we just simply did was say, this is how you can do it, and they agreed, and they surpassed us. At the end of ours, whereas 13% when we went in, 81% of the kids in that school could read and write by the end of grade 3. But the fundamental point that I would make is that when the chief of the community, the 2 chiefs of the community, made the announcement of what their kids had done, and they looked out in the audience, and the one chief was Tom Brissett, whom you know. He was a big, burly guy. The tears flowing down his eyes, looked out at the audience, and he said, "You didn't think we could do it. You give us the tools that you have, and we'll show you what we can do." And that's what we're trying to do. We've got other programs. I just talked about one of them. We have a business course. Think about it, what's happening in Canada. Up until now, if you want to take a business course in a school, in a public high school, you take a business course that basically teaches you what business is like in Toronto, Montreal, or Vancouver, but not the communities in which Indigenous kids live. And there are none of the role models are Indigenous. So what we did is we created an Indigenous business course. And we started off in 2 schools, and we are now in 80 schools, 40 schools across the country, and we're going to get to 80. That is the kind of thing. We have another program, which is Cindy Blackstock, who's a very well-known advocate, Indigenous advocate in this country, has said the toughest time for kids is from the age of 0 to 4, which is when your brain is being formed. So we've created a system of home visitors within the community. These are mothers who succeeded in raising their families. We have a phenomenal success in our pilot project. We now 4 other communities have asked to join, and we're going to expand this. So what it really is all we really do is take the knowledge that the First Nations have and basically provide a little bit of the initiative to get it going and some of the money. And I'll tell you, I believe that if we're going to succeed, and it's going to revolutionize the education system, and that's going to revolutionize Canada.
Yep. Absolutely. And as you said, Senator Sinclair, we have the wherewithal to show them what we need, because we already know that we have what we call wise practices, right? We have a long history of actually knowing, so we're contributing somewhere to that. Okay, so the next question, I'm going to start with you, Senator Sinclair. This is an important question, because this is what everybody here is going to be talking about. And it says, it feels like we're teetering on the edge of a massive global transformation. Whether we're talking about politics, whether we're talking about education, it doesn't matter. What's the biggest threat that you see today? And what advice would you like to give those that are listening to us?
I think there are 2 major threats, and they're related. First of all, there's the impact that we're having as a society on the climate, and the climate change argument is is one that's ongoing, and it's having a dramatic impact upon not only our environment, but the way that we live and how we're going to be living into the future. Our communities, at a very fundamental level, are going to be affected and negatively affected unless and until we begin to do something about it. And again, it's the children who are leading the way in the conversation. And Greta Thunberg, with her movement to inspire young children to protest to politicians on Friday by taking time from class, is part of that. My granddaughter, who made me dress up as Shrek, she's part of that movement in the city of Winnipeg, and she's very much involved in it, and she believes fervently in that. So I think that's a significant issue, and it's going to have an impact upon our lives and on our relationship, because there are people who will take advantage of that to the detriment of the rest of society, who will become self-protective and ignore the needs of others in doing that. And that leads me to my second major concern about the future, which is the fact that there is this growing movement of right-wing thinkers in the world who are trying to take over the economies of the world, who are taking over the political regimes. And you can see it not only around the world with various national governments and their relationship with each other, but you also see it within Canada, where governments are being formed at the provincial level, which take a particular view about the relationship that they will have with Indigenous people. And from the perspective of Indigenous people, the growth that we hoped would be inspired by the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the work to improve that relationship can easily be pushed back. As I said at the last day of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings, getting to the truth was hard, but getting to reconciliation will be harder.
Yeah.
Not because we don't understand it, but because there will quickly be forces that will rise up against it because it's not in their interests. And which is why it was so important for us to work to develop allies such as Mr. Martin and others. We brought them in as honorary witnesses to observe the proceedings so that they were aware of the truth, so that they could in turn use their stature and status and knowledge and relationships and networks in society to inspire non-Indigenous people to pay attention and to start doing things, and to also take action in their own way. And that's been, I think, the true mark of success of the work of the TRC.
Yeah, I think so as well. So what would you have to say? I mean, you've been a high-ranking, obviously the highest politician. You know that there's a lot going on in the world today. What do you have to say about?
Well, let me pick up just a little bit from where the senator left off. We have just lived through the most productive in terms of the economy 75 years in the history of the world. My generation is the and you can come in is the luckiest generation ever. If you take a look at the economic growth that we have had. With this began at the end of the Second World War, when, having recognized the terrible mess that the first half of the last century was, people decided to do something about it. It began with the Marshall Plan from the United States to helping Europe come back, really under the leadership of many of the Western countries, but certainly the United States played a very important role. What happened was that we understood the need for collective action. We understood that national sovereignty was important, but essentially it can't be my country only, that it would require us to work together. The fact of the matter is, if you look today at climate change, no country, if Canada decided we're going to solve the climate change problem in Canada, it wouldn't matter if the rest of the world didn't participate. The fact is that national sovereignty, you can't build walls which will keep contagious disease out of the country. You can't go and decide you're going to clean your beaches so that you have clean oceans if somebody else is simply dumping plastics in the ocean. You have to work together. The only way in which the world can go ahead is if we work together. Globalization is not some decision by governments. It is a fact of life. And we have understood that for the last 75 years. And the fact is that the United States, which has played a very important role in the leadership of this, has benefited economically, because we would all benefit economically if, in fact, the world is growing. Now, that is what is under challenge. And I'm going to just tell you that what's happening. It's under challenge because we see the debates that are taking place in the world. But some of you know I was very actively involved in the creation of the G20. And my perspective is the following, that we have a world today very much led by the hegemon, which was the United States, and the Western countries, the Western world, Western Europe, obviously North America. If you want to make the projections going ahead, what you're going to see is that within the next 20 years, China and conceivably India are going to have larger economies than the United States. Now, that is not per capita. That doesn't mean they're going to be richer. The Americans will be individuals, but the populations are so much larger there. They will be the dominant economic powers. What we're seeing happening right now in countries in Asia, Korea, Indonesia, are growing very fast, and the European countries are not. It's a very different world 20 to 30 years from now. And if we don't understand that it's much more difficult to work together when you've got 3 or 4 hegemons, very hard to work together when you've got a number of emerging economies, you will understand that the G20, as the G20 of today, is the rehearsal for tomorrow. This is the kind of world that we have got to open up. And unfortunately, exactly, the senator hit it, because of some movements within our own countries, people who think we can build borders between ourselves or walls between ourselves and other countries, we can't do it. You can't stop pandemic disease. You can't basically deal with climate change, which is the biggest issue we face, unless we work together. And not everybody is talking that way. And I believe Canada's got to play.
We have lots of time. Would you like to respond to Mr. Martin?
Well, I think the reality is that there's a strong element within Canadian society and also around the world that is working hard in order to try to benefit from this in some way, from this chaos which they're trying to create at the same time. And the risk that's run is that the vulnerable people of the world are going to be left behind. And they're not only going to be left behind, but they're actually going to end up being sacrificed in the process. Their lives are going to be further deteriorating, and their participation in the economy is going to be reduced. In Indigenous Canada, for example, among young Indigenous people, we have the highest rate of attendance at post-secondary institutions now than we've ever had before. But when they get out, if their communities are not self-sustaining, or if their communities are not able to support them, they won't be able to find work helping their own people. They won't be able to go back to their communities because they won't be able to find housing. They won't be able to find jobs because the economies within their communities won't be able to support them. And government funding is going to be restricted. And so the reality is going to be that we have to find different ways of feeding the people. And right now, we're not seeing that. We're not seeing the leadership that's going to make that kind of structural change. And when we see leadership like that evolving, then we also see a rise in leadership that fights that. And so it creates chaos and it creates fear within the population, and we have to be terribly concerned about the willingness of people to create fear.
Yes. And what would you recommend those leaders? We see those leaders coming up.
Yep.
We know that they're coming up, and they're coming up quite strongly. And there is also a pushback, because there's a resistance to Indigenous leadership or other certain kinds of leadership, global environmental leadership, because, as you say, there are people that want to make money on this and don't necessarily want to see the planet survive in the way that we think it should. What can we tell the leaders that are in the audience to help them understand what they need to do to actually be of assistance?
Well, it goes back to a simple understanding of how one fights things like racism, for example. It's not enough simply not to be racist. You actually have to be an anti-racist. You have to actively work against it. And when you see things that are happening that you disagree with, or that you recognize or see or become convinced is a negative direction for society, you actively have to work to change that from happening at all levels. You know, the most common question that I get when I do presentations about residential schools and the work of the TRC is when people say, what can I do? What are you asking of us? What is it that we can do about this? And I always say to them, find something that you can do in all of this knowledge that we've now developed. Find something that fits into your abilities, fits into your network, fits into your relationship, fits into your capacity and capability, and do it. Every little step is an important step. And also recognize that the most important change is going to be one that comes from young people. Education is the key to reconciliation in Canada. I've said that for years now. And what I mean by that is it's the way we educate our children to relate to each other. It's the way we educate our children to respect each other. And it's also about changing the way that recognizing the way we have been educating children has contributed significantly to the poor relationship that we have now and to the past policies and legislation that's been in place. And if we're going to change that, if we're going to change that attitude, then we have to begin with the children and continue to work in that way. So the question of how we address it, it has to have a short-term focus by the leaders, like the leaders who are in the room here. And that means that you actively have to recognize it as an issue that we have to do something about and do what you can in the spheres that you work in. But we also have to take a long-term approach, and that long-term is that we have to do what we can to ensure that the children who are growing up, our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren, have better access to more information and a greater understanding of what it is that we've been doing, how it happened, and what we can do to prevent it in the future.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. And Mr. Martin, you're working on a very important initiative through the Martin Foundation, and we're trying to ensure that we have Indigenous leadership stepping up. So I'm going to ask you, because you're a white male, no offense, doing work.
You're the minority here.
Doing work in Indigenous communities, which I think is fabulous. But we're trying to lift our leadership. And I know you work with children, but what is your succession plan? Are you working with young leaders in the maybe 30 to 40 range that will be able to take over the work you're doing and actually do it just as well?
I'm going to say yes to that, but I want to just make one comment on what the senator said, and then I will. There is no choice here in terms of what the senator said. Indigenous, the youngest and the fastest growing segment of the Canadian population are Indigenous Canadians. We're talking about the future. And essentially, if those young people are not given the opportunities that they must have to lead, then we as a country are going to suffer deeply. And we've got to understand, Don Drummond, who used to be with me in the Department of Finance and is now teaching at Queen's, has done a study showing that while the Indigenous people are about just under 5% of the population, looking ahead for 10 years, they are going to be 20% of the workforce, the new workforce. That's doctors, lawyers, and whatever you want to have. So we're not going to build. We're not going to achieve that. And so, now what was your question? It's what happens when you turn 80. Go ahead.
My question was, well, it's actually associated to that. You're doing some really terrific work. You're working in Indigenous communities.
Succession
What
plan,
is our
yeah.
succession plan?
The succession is clearly the people there. When we go into a community, when we went into the community, let's say with the early years program, okay, and what we did is we went out, we obviously met with the chief, we met with the council, we did this whole thing. The first thing that we did was to get a supervisor who was from the community, who had been there. Then all of the home visitors are mothers who had raised their children within the community. But we made it very clear, our purpose is to go in there, work with them to set it up, and then walk. It's theirs, they take it over. And the whole purpose of everything that we are in the process of doing is simply we are a medium. But this will all have to be in First Nations hands, in the First Nations communities, in Inuit hands, or in Métis hands, because they're the ones. We didn't bring, in fact, it's very interesting. When we went in with, this is how you raise your children, all we simply did is confirm what they already knew. Everything that we have done is to confirm, because they're so far ahead of us. But the problem is, the money has been so short, the prejudice has been so great, they've just not had a chance. So all we really do is we open the door to what they know and what they say, and we are there while they build it.
Great. Any comments on, we had a couple minutes. Some of the questions I think that we had talked about a little bit was the idea that getting young people to listen and understand that there's a lot of wisdom inherent in the leadership that has gone before. You know, how do we get them to access that information? What's a tool that you've used?
Well, within Indigenous Canada, within the Indigenous community, I've noticed for the last several years now, probably the last decade or longer, that there is a very strong growth by young people to try to figure out who they are and how they fit into this society. And it's not because they necessarily want to be assimilated into it, but it's part of their need to understand why things are the way they are and what happened. But coming out of that, as I said earlier, is this recognition that their sense of self has been damaged significantly by the way that Canada has treated Indigenous people historically, not just Canada, the government, but the Canadian society, in terms of how it's talked about Indigenous people and the denigration that's occurred. When Indigenous children were placed in residential schools, they were told from the moment they arrived that they were savages and heathens and pagans and that their cultures were irrelevant, their language was not permitted to be spoken. And from all of that grew this sense of inferiority that was engendered within the survivors of residential schools. And we have to remember that the schools were in place for 7 generations. When you have that many generations of children who are taught to be inferior, we are going to end up with a population of people who just don't know who they are. They don't have a sense of connection to their culture, to their traditions, to their identity. At the same time, the Canadian society was reinforcing in the public school system those very same principles, which had the other side of the coin impact on the non-Indigenous population, to reinforce for them that European cultures were superior, European people were superior, and that they saved Indigenous people from extinction. And so that sense of superiority on the one side, inferiority on the other, is now at loggerheads with each other. And that's why education is the key. But what that's engendered within Indigenous youth now is a search for their identity. And we've said in the TRC report, as other reports have said, that the key to reconciliation is mutual respect, the development of a relationship founded on mutual respect. But before you can have mutual respect, Indigenous people have to be given the opportunity to gain self-respect. And part of it comes from being able to succeed in educational environments, but I think it also comes from understanding who they are, their traditions, their cultures, and their sense of history. And that's very important, and I see that as what's going to happen soon.
Let me just say that essentially the studies are now showing that 40% of the kids going into grade 1 this September in Canada 40% of them are going to have jobs that don't exist today. That is the world. Now, from a Canadian point of view, strictly Canada as a whole, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, it is crucial that we be ahead of that, evolution. And that's where education has to take us. Now, there is no choice that Indigenous kids have got to be 100% part of that. I go back to it. They are the youngest and the fastest growing segment of our population. We will not have an economy if we don't do the right thing. And the right thing, Senator, is to do what you're talking about.
And we have, I mean, as an educator, we have now got, we must have at least 10,000 PhDs, so many master's degrees, at least 50,000, 60,000 kids that have gone through undergraduate programs and have graduated, so, and trades. And we are doing the education thing in this country, and I think we're doing it very well. The difference is for our Indigenous students is when they complete, quite often they go back to their communities, or at least they try to, as you said earlier. They try to go back to their communities to help other people take the same pathway. And I think we're being quite successful. A lot of the universities across Canada will tell you that the increased population of Indigenous students has done very well. And we are going to be leaders, and we are also trying to get people to understand that it's not only about technology, it's not only about AI, it's also about the land, it's about the environment, and it's about doing those jobs that ensure that we have safe water into the future and that we have a planet that's healthy. So I think those are the jobs that the Indigenous community is looking at as being very important, and we must get other people to understand that that's an important part of where we're going in the future.
The other thing is that we've got to build trust, and this is something that came so much out of the senators commission. The question of trust. I've just come from a university in Western Canada who have a transition program, basically from the reserve into college, and it is really important because so many of these kids coming in historically have been basically told to leave their culture, leave their traditions at the door. And what we really got to be saying now is bring your cultures with you and keep them here. And I can see it happen. I am now very confident and feeling very good about where we're going. And thanks to you in long measure. And I think that that kind of confidence in the future is going to happen. But boy, do we have to meet it.
Yes, we do. Yes. Any final words?
Well, reconciliation is going to take a long time. It's going to take a long time for us to figure out this relationship. And I've said, and when the TRC ended, I said it's probably not going to occur within my lifetime. May not even occur in the lifetime of my children. But as we progress each and every day and achieve those things that we can achieve today, we will eventually see reconciliation occurring in which we have a mutually respectful relationship in the future between our grandchildren or their grandchildren.
Just as in the final minutes that we have, I want to ask both of you to help the people in the audience have an understanding of reconciliation and what it is from your perspectives.
Well,
reconciliation is when you get a tough question, pass it to the next guy.
Reconciliation is it's a contextual phrase. It actually is something that you can talk about in different situations in different ways. But we talked about it in the TRC report within the context of the mandate that we had, which was to talk about the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people and how that relationship had evolved and what kind of relationship we have now and what kind of relationship we should have and how we get there. And the process of reconciliation that we talked about was to do the kinds of things that we called for in our calls to action, and that is to address the immediate problems, to make commitments so that we can't easily fall back into the patterns that we had used previously, and that we also developed a commitment to the future, which was founded upon our sense of responsibility to and for each other. But in its simplest form, I say reconciliation is really this. I want to be your friend, and I want you to be mine. And if we are friends, then we will take care of each other when each of us needs that help.
Thank you. I want to be your friend too. Okay, smart.
I think it's trust. I think that the history of this country is we betrayed the trust of the Indigenous people. I think that I've talked to some people coming from remote communities, going into university, and they have talked to me about what it feels like to leave that community, to go into a university in a big city, which they've never been in before, and suddenly realizing that they're meeting people who, as you know, so many Canadians have never met an Indigenous person, despite the large numbers, and they talk to me about what it's like. So I think what it really is they have to be able to trust that history is past, and it's really, and that hands are open. I also think, and I think that's understandable. I think it's a moral issue, but I just can't emphasize more than ever. It is the single most important economic issue that we have as a country. These young people have got to succeed, and it's true every country. Young people have to succeed, but they are the youngest and the fastest growing. And I can't repeat it enough. They are the youngest, the fastest growing segment of our population. They are our future.
Thank you.
May I just want to give a closing story about something that also always inspires me thinking about reconciliation going forward. When I was appointed to the Senate, my granddaughter, Sarah, the one who I used to dress up for, she still wants me to dress up on Halloween for her, but she invited me to come into her class to talk to her students about the fact that I was appointed a senator and to talk about that. And so I said, I'll come, but you have to introduce me. And so she introduced me, and she talked about the work that I did as a lawyer, the work that I did as a judge, and the work that I did at the TRC. And she was part of the TRC process, so she had a great deal of familiarity about that. And she was very proud of that work. And then she concluded her remarks by saying, and now he's a senator. And then she sat down. And a little boy put up his hand in her class, and he said, what does a senator do? And she stood up, and she put her hands on her hips, and she turned and she looked at me, and I realized that she had no idea. But that didn't stop her. She just considered all of the work that I'd been doing over the years, and she turned around and she looked at that little boy and she said, he sanitizes.
You gotta love kids. Absolutely.
So I think that's also part of what reconciliation is about, is so let's clean up this mess.
Sanitize it.
I love it.
All right. Thank you. I want to thank both of you for a very interesting and informative dialogue. We're not going to be taking any questions, but as I understand it, they've agreed to be available for a few minutes after the session, and we'll answer some questions for you directly from the floor. And thank you so much for all of this. It's been terrific. Thank you.
Hey there. Thank you. Okay.
On behalf of the ILA, on behalf of my colleagues at the City of Ottawa, and on behalf of this attentive audience, it's now my pleasure
Should we leave the stage?
and the honor to thank you for this inspired conversation this morning. Right Honourable Paul Martin, Senator Murray Sinclair, Cynthia, I know our global audience have learned a lot this morning about a tremendously troubling part of our Canadian history and our global history, and about the courage, the authenticity, the presence that we all must find to lead our communities towards a new and changed legacy for Canada and for the Indigenous peoples that we share with this land. We know that our story in Canada, while it's troubling, is not unique. Our conversation this morning will no doubt inspire this global audience to advocate for a better life, better conditions, better education, and a better world of opportunity for Indigenous people everywhere. So please, again, show our appreciation for these honored guests. We have a small gift before you leave the stage of appreciation. We'll follow it down.
Okay.
I'll bring the gifts out to them later. And as people are preparing for the next sessions, I remind everyone that your next session begins at 10:15. On your way to the sessions, please be sure to grab a coffee or a tea at the grab-and-go coffee station outside the room and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Glenn.
Sit down.
Thank you. I got a feeling we're not going to be able to
Well
sit
done.
down much, so.
Is this yours?
Oh, there you are, yes. See if we can fit that back into mine. It's not mine, and I don't need any more. I've already got two.
How are you?
I want to tell you that, inspired by your work,
Sure.
I interviewed you for my PhD. I studied law and supervision and some politics.
John?
And
Wall?
you've done it so well. I had a book, and I wanted to see if you could sort of forward on that book.
Yeah, this is my boss. Okay.
What do you want from the Senate? What do you want from the Well, those were
All right.
good session. Well done.
There you go.
Oh, hi.
Thank you very much.
You're Kate. I can tell because you got a sign. You're wearing a sign.
Thank you very much.
All right, yes, we'll get together. Okay. Oh, no, thank you.
Separately. Who are you? Sorry.
Oh, not at all.
Enjoy the. Have you been before? My colleague, Professor.
Well, it's
we're doing our session on democracy.